Neil, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks
You're
for coming
welcome.
down.
Always a pleasure.
This has been such an extraordinary election here a week or two ago. I mean, people are still shaking their heads what happened. How come, Neil Abercrombie beat Mufi Hannemann by such a huge margin? I'm sure you thought about that.
Yeah, there's two parts to that. One is how come, and the other is why are people shaking their heads, which has to do with
Okay, good
finding
point.
out
Yeah,
about
yeah,
it.
yeah,
The how come, I think the best way to tell the story is to think about the fact that there were about 4 or 5 polls over this course of this. There weren't a lot of polls that we had. The candidates had others. And what you see is that in a poll that was done in early August, up until that time it had been very close. The poll that was taken in early August was the time in which Mufi Hannemann had the most support. He was still behind, but he had about 44% of the voters said they were going to support him. The next poll that's done, a month later by Civil Beat, shows that support had dropped from 44 to 31. That was a precipitous drop in elections. It just doesn't happen that often, and the surprising thing is that it happened with candidates where there hadn't been much undecided voters up to that point. Now, what happened in August? It's hard to know for sure. One of the things that did happen was that famous mailer that Mufi Hannemann put out that he got so much criticism for. That is the mail about Neil's beard and making those kinds of comparisons, many of which were gratuitous and so on. And that
Gratuitous.
Gratuitous.
Thank you for that word.
Yeah, I mean, you can say other things about it from an ad construction standpoint. It was gratuitous. He could have run an ad like that and done a better job by leaving out some of the stuff. In any case, so that ad probably played some role in making that stuff roll downhill. And the Civil Beat poll suggests that was an important factor for voters. But I think something else was starting to happen at the time. What was starting to happen is that the support that Hannemann had was softer, and that people began to move away from Hannemann. And I think a good example about why that happened was the unions. Hannemann had a whole bunch of unions lined up for him. People who were talking about the election said it gives Hannemann a big advantage because he's got the endorsement. But the endorsement's effect depends upon who you're running against. And Abercrombie has very strong labor union support, even in those unions, with the rank and file. And I think that what was starting to happen then was a chipping away from the Hannemann support, including some of these people, and they began to move over, and that's where the precipitous slide started to happen. So by the time the Civil Beat poll is done, Abercrombie's up by about 17%, which turns out to be about right. And by the end, I think his own kind of rolling polls by election day had him up by 20. This could not then come as a surprise to either Abercrombie or Hannemann. Now, why does it happen? I already suggested part of the reason that it happened. Part of it is that the things that some people assumed were definitive turned out to be not definitive at all in favor of Hannemann. One was the union support. Just because you've got unions doesn't mean that people vote for you. Another thing was newspaper endorsements, kind of standard stuff. That everybody knows newspaper endorsements don't make that much of a difference. I think what was happening was a kind of undercurrent, a kind of campaign below the radar, not secret, but the kinds of things you don't find out about in the newspapers. Abercrombie is a terrific face-to-face campaigner. He came back early to make sure that his network was set up to do this kind of campaign, that he had people on the ground to do it. He knows, I'm sure, from the lessons that Obama taught everybody, that there are important ways to use social media, especially if you tie social media into your face-to-face grassroots stuff, so that the social media becomes another way of being interactive and personal. It isn't just putting stuff out on the website. So all of those things, I think, really were the main factors in conspiring. And it isn't even so much that Hannemann did much wrong. You could see in the ads the last week when everybody thought Mufi was going to have this steamroller media effect with a lot of money, basically those ads had nothing. The ads were more of the same. And it's not because the ad people weren't smart. It's because by then there really wasn't anything that you could do through an ad that was going to turn this thing around. So that it's longer than a nutshell, but shorter than a book, is my explanation.
Okay, now we can do Q&A.
Yeah, now you can do Q&A. You could have done it all the way along the line. You were just too polite to interrupt me. Yeah, go ahead. Edit out
I was
this stuff.
entranced.
Yeah, the word is asleep.
It's similar.
Yeah, similar. That's right. Yeah, there. Yes.
So what about all the dirty tricks? What role did they play?
Well, as I say, generally the effect of negative campaigning is mixed. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's a weasel answer, but it's to point out to people that just because they're indignant by ads doesn't mean that they don't work for some. I think in the case of two things that Hannemann did that people complained about, in both cases they did work against Hannemann. One was that brochure that I talked about,
the pink
right,
stuff.
the pink thing. And
Vote, it would compare and decide.
compare and decide, I'm tall, he's short, whatever.
Yeah.
I think the other thing was that early speech that he gave to the union that is, I'm like you. I think what that was, putting aside the issue of racism or whatever else, being local is still an important factor in Hawaii politics. Being, ethnicity is still an important factor, but it's important in different ways, in less direct ways, and in less ways that trump everything else. And I think the lack of subtlety of that hurt him. That it sounded like a campaign that somebody would have done in 1975. So in those ways, I think that the ads did work that kind of tactic did work against them. I thought, all in all, it was not a very dirty campaign at all. I mean, my God, it was pretty quiet. There wasn't much negative stuff. One of the things that happens at the end of campaigns sometimes is that a rumor starts. And
Sure.
no one can
remember the Duke Bainham campaign.
The Duke Bainham campaign, the C. Seftel campaign, it's almost a part of lore, and it's easy for people in this town who have very vivid political imaginations to say, hey, that's going to happen again. It never happened again.
No, it wasn't even close. As a
No,
matter of fact,
nothing.
the ads the last week were very, very soft.
They were
and-
nice ads.
Yeah, the kinder, gentler person really emerges,
Well, they were the same ads that people were running at the beginning for him. And that you knew that if that's all, is that all you got, then you knew that there was trouble for Hannemann.
Yeah, now what about this thing about endorsements, Not that I followed endorsements all my life, but it seemed like this campaign was like, it was all about endorsements. Are they really that important?
Well, the campaign wasn't all about endorsements. The way the campaign was covered was all about endorsements.
Okay.
It's very easy to cover campaigns by looking at who gets endorsed and who doesn't get endorsed. Just as it's easy to cover campaigns by showing debates and showing very public kind of presentations. Now, I'm not saying they're unimportant, but their importance the importance of those things is exaggerated. Newspapers that make endorsements, those kind of endorsements generally don't make much difference. They'll make some difference, but in a big margin, they're not going to.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because, I was troubled by the fact that there's only one print press in town, and that newspaper takes it upon itself to make an endorsement, knowing there's nobody really no print press that's going to argue with
Well,
them.
that's true, but you also have to ask two questions. Does anybody read it? And the answer is some people, but not a lot overall. Newspaper is down. Secondly, who are the people that read it? And I'm pretty sure that the people who read the paper, read about politics, read about endorsements, are the ones more likely to make up their mind. So
It defeats itself.
It doesn't defeat it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff like that. And the people who pay attention to the media, who look more closely at politics, are the ones who are the most partisan in either direction. So you're not going to sway them very much. The union endorsements, again, it's all about it depends. You can count up the number of unions and say, well, look how many are on one side, but it also depends on what other kinds of union connections, say, that Abercrombie had. Here's a guy who's a strong union guy.
Forever,
right?
yeah.
And it isn't just that people know him and like him. He's got connections in there. He has
knows the officers.
He knows the officers. He knows people in the rank and file.
Yeah.
So I don't want to deny the importance of endorsements. It's better probably to get them than not to get them. But that's just the beginning of the story. And too often it's told as if it's the end of the story also.
Going to the civil beat, it is to their credit that their
Yeah.
poll turned out to be accurate. But did they play a significant role in this election by the poll or otherwise?
No. By then, this one is fairly easy for me because by then the majority was so much in favor of Abercrombie that they didn't really play a role in that. It came out very late, and in fact, the margin did increase by a couple points after that. Polls generally don't play that big a role. And so I would say not. And again, it isn't like Civil Beat is read by lots of people. It became very influential because the people in the know, the interested one, either read it or heard about it because it started getting reported. Lots of folks were being very conservative about that poll because it was a little bit of an anomaly. We weren't getting a lot of polls that were showing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. But you don't have a lot of polls.
We don't have a lot of
then
polls,
The very
period.
few polls make more difference.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I was involved in the war of the dueling capital venture associations, and I have to say that the venture association that he threw together in August was really of no consequence at all. I mean, they were just thrown together to make an endorsement. And the interesting thing is that the people who were aware of that, were really turned off by what he did.
Sure.
But on the other hand, it never got into the public. For one reason or another, the press didn't cover it very much, or they covered it by saying, well, got all these venture capitalists, they argue among themselves all the time.
Yeah.
not really reporting it accurately. So I just wonder how that kind of thing plays, because it was not just the venture capital associations. There were a lot of things like that. Some of them were tongue-in-cheek. Some of them you could sort of defend, like Keith Rollman did, by saying, "Oh, we're just kidding, just kidding."
Two guys in a saxophone with a sign that says whatever, venture capital. I forget. Now, see, you got me now. I don't remember which one is yours and which one is his. It worked.
If they intended to confuse everybody,
They
did.
Well, but they got an easy target with me. So, well, I mean, the thing about those things is that they stimulate some people, they anger some people, but your neighbor, whoever your neighbor is not likely to know anything about
Right.
it, and that's the important thing to understand. So in a close election, when things are really close, then anything can make a difference. But then just the word getting out among a few people. But what you're talking about with those things, it turns out, is the need to influence a relatively large number of people who are not that clued into political information as the average person isn't. And so that stuff, it isn't that it goes over their head. It doesn't even get in their ears or eyes.
Richard Barreca wrote a piece a couple of months ago, and he said, Moofy has decided that these kinds of tricks, work. And I think you're saying that too. At the end of the day, they work. So he's going to do them, even if he gets caught. I think this came out right after the compare and decide piece.
Yeah.
He was a little wrong about that.
Well, as I say, the evidence is pretty mixed about negative stuff. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And there's an argument to be made with say the compare one that it could have been done. It could have been a more effective negative ad. It's hard for people to think along those ways because they get so indignant. It's hard for them to get their morality out of there. But he took a chance there, and it didn't work very well. But when I think about it now, those two little negative things that he did that turned out not to work were probably, that alone wasn't enough, but it was indicative of a kind of campaign that he was running. Not a negative campaign, but a campaign that was relying on kind of tactics of communication and old ideas, like I'm like you, and the public school, private school sort of things that still play in some ways, but in much more subtle, much less direct ways, and where you can't raise them the same way. And I think what he was really doing is fighting the last war. He was a general who was fighting the last war.
And maybe he was fighting too hard, and fighting being the operative word.
Yeah.
Because this was a big campaign, big issue for him, and look what happened.
Sure.
Look where he is now.
I agree.
mean, I think he got like too excited about it somehow.
Sure. Well, it's a trap in some ways. If you're a mayor of a big city, I don't care what big city, and I don't care almost who you are, there might be a few exceptions, you're going to take a hit for a lot of things that you're doing. If you're a good mayor, you are. You can make the argument that there is no other way to get rail through than the way that Mayor Hannemann did. And But you take an enormous amount of hits for it. You make a lot of enemies. People, it's a collection of individual grievances, and a lot of things about politics now are about being victims of those. It's no coincidence that we've had presidents presidents of the United States over the last few years who were basically unemployed before they became Carter wasn't. Well, Carter was a politician out of work. Clinton was a politician out of work. It gives you a little bit of space to get away from being blamed for individual stuff. And Neil, it turns out, saw the advantages of that too. He saw that advantage, and he knew that what he had to do in addition to that is to get back here and start a campaign so he could take advantage of the fact that he could begin to rebuild his image at the same time Mufi has to run this place.
But you know, there were a couple of things that come to mind on that. Number one is, I think people rightly considered him too talkative. He would talk, not listen.
You mean Neil?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he changed his persona.
Yes.
His advisors, who I think were very, very adept, explained to him that he changed that around, and he did effectively do that. The other thing, it seems like, is that when provoked, he didn't rise to the bait. He was very disciplined about not rising to, or falling, as the case may be, to a different level of politics.
No, it's true. In fact, I used to watch his ads because I've known him for a long time, and I think lots of people who paid, a little bit more than passing attention know this. You'd watch him in the ads, knowing that he was restraining the passion that he has. You could almost see it. You could see in these ads two things. First of all, his suits were better tailored than they normally were, and second, his haircut. Yeah, his haircut. And I think he's a great talker. He's always been a pretty good listener. What he did this time was not to talk as much and not to take the offensive as much. And that's not easy to do for a politician who's as full of passion as he is. When he would be I saw him in a forum where the passion comes out a little bit more, but it comes out within the time limit. And it's not anger. So
Sure, it was redirected. It
was redirected. Yeah.
Where I could be angry, instead I'm gonna talk passionately about my ideas, my views,
right,
and get it out of my system that way.
No, that's right. That's right. They were both pretty. I mean, they do have different styles of presentation, and it's kind of interesting to watch. I mean, the Mayor Hannemann isn't dynamic, but in his own style, he's really good on the stump. He was actually better, I think, when he ran against Duke Bainham. I saw one of the debates that he did, and he has and I didn't see it as much in this one, but he has a remarkable ability of taking a complex issue and dealing with it in terms of a story to bring it home all within, 60 seconds sometimes. And that's a real art, and he does it in a style that's, kind of quiet and low-key.
They had different kinds of organizations, too. I mean, I think Mufi had a lot of people in City Hall who were backing him up. I remember I went down to the debate and I saw all these guys in red shirts and everything. It looked a lot like the city employee, force of the city employees.
I'm shocked.
You don't look shocked, Neil.
Yeah, no. This was the Hawaii News Now debate where they.
Yeah. That was very interesting.
It was very interesting, right? Where they let the people applaud at the end of kind of a contrived stump debate. Yeah.
Well, and then you could measure the organization of each candidate by the kind of applause,
I guess,
the kind of catcalls and reactions. And
true, although to me it was. I mean, if you're going to do that, you got to do it all the way, right? It was like
let go.
It was too much studio audience. It was sort of half studio audience and half the other thing. But you're right. I know what you're saying. There was a different kind of feeling with it.
Well, it was, the whole thing was different. In fact, I remember at the Abercrombie. The CompUSA party afterwards, I noticed the same thing, that it was really well covered. There was a serious effort by the press to do serious reporting there on scene. And the one at what was it, at the conventions at the Hawaii News Now one you mentioned a minute ago. That was really well covered. Gee whiz, they had 7, I counted them, 7 cameras there, and it was very intense. The crowd was all wound up. Hasn't happened before quite like that, has it?
But there's a lesson to be learned there. Sure, it was well covered, but just because it's well covered doesn't mean it's as important as the coverage may suggest that it is. And it's absolutely important that these things get covered by as many people as that. But at the same token, you have to figure out a way to have sophisticated coverage of things that don't show up so easily on a camera. For example, social media. Now, the KITV, for example, does have a person now who does a social media report regularly. It isn't tied into the political realm that much yet, but covering a campaign like this one, as it turns out, what we were just saying about Neil, his ability to do face-to-face stuff, the way social media works, comparing movies to Neil's, they both had it. That's not necessarily sexy. And whether it's sexy or not, you don't cover it the same way, but that's the sort of stuff that was not covered very much here.
Yeah, well, the thing at the Bukaki room, that's the one, right, in the Blaisdell Center, the Hawaii News Now thing, that was really active, good entertainment.
Sure.
The lighting, and everything was organized that way. And I say to myself, does this mean that we are going to get an educated public or not? And, was the public sufficiently educated in that race where you could say they had enough information to make a proper decision?
No, and I think that's partly because of the way the public gets educated, but also because it's only a moment in time. There's a kind of sad answer and a happy answer to that. The sad answer is that the public pays as a whole. The best you can say is that most of the people pay attention to politics some of the time, and some is a pretty small amount. So the debate may not even been an issue to them. But the other side of it is you can't expect too much from a debate. First of all, these are more forums than debates. This is not Lincoln and Douglas, where you go back and forth and you really learn
Actually
about
hit
policies.
the point.
Yeah, you hit the point. So there's limited information that you're going to get from these things. So the debate is, to me, important as a kind of symbol of democratic accountability. People running for office should have to put themselves up, especially if the populace wants to see them. But don't get carried away about what kinds of information they give or how many people watch it. We're talking about a state in which the turnout was 40%. What do you think the percentage was of people who watched this thing, and what do you think the percentage was of people who actually took it seriously enough to put it into their calculus? It's pretty small.
Yeah. So does this election, it seems to me this election, at least in my time, was a high-stakes election because the future of both candidates, this one, was hanging in the balance, and it did affect the future of both candidates for sure. The question is, does this change the way politics works in Hawaii?
It's too soon to tell, which is the weasel answer. The other answer is that, to me, it's really significant to see how little politics has changed in Hawaii in the almost 40 years I've been here, and how much the culture has changed. That if you look at markers of what this place is like, this place is really quite different in terms of its urban geography, in terms of where people buy, in terms of the renaissance of Hawaiian culture, in terms of influence from mainland economics. But there isn't much difference between what Tom Kaufman wrote about this place in 1970, and he and I had a conversation on Monday about this, or what Dan Boylan says about 1970, and he and I had a conversation about this a couple of hours ago, than what politics is now. The Republican Party is weak. The Democratic Party still fights out things within itself. And the party still, there are certain other dynamics that are around. Social conservatives and so on. But the basic framework, the basic everyday stuff, the way the legislature works, the way people vote, is still pretty much the same.
So how is this result, aside from the mechanical aspect of who's running now, how does this result, the way this was conducted, the way it came out, how does it affect the rest of the election going forward now in November between a Republican and Democrat candidate?
Well, at one level, it's the same. That is, either of these two Democratic candidates would start with a head start over Duke Iona. That's just the way it is. That's not about competence. That's about the history of the Democratic and Republican Party and party identification. I think that the Iona people, although they were probably getting a sense of this, have to get over a kind of cockiness that they had about how easy Neil might be to beat. I think they saw him partly through the eyes of the social conservatives, and also through the kind of stereotypes over the years that he's basically still this kind of wild-eyed hippie. And if this campaign didn't give them a reality test, then they're really in trouble. So I would say that it still starts the same way. I think that the Republicans are going to probably rethink their strategies a little bit more, but it's still a fundamental issue for the Republican Party as a minority. The fundamental issue is still the same, and that is, if essentially the minority of people don't support the Republican Party, how do you appeal to your very socially conservative base and still be able to reach out into the broader community to get votes, which is also Charles Dejeu's issue. That would have been the same for either one of the candidates. And I frankly don't think that the fact that that the civil union issue is going to make that much of a difference. The Republicans are certainly going to want to make that a difference, but that issue is still in flux. It's still not important enough or even visible enough to the electorate as a whole to really have a great impact on the election.
So now we see Neil Abercrombie in his latest iteration. And some people said he conducted this campaign like a governor. I mean, I kept thinking that because it seemed to me that was going on. So what kind of a governor would he make if he gets through this process and becomes the governor?
Well, I think it's probably, it's what you see is what you get, with one huge proviso, and that is there ain't any money, right? Mm-hmm. So he's doing what every politician ever does, and that is tells you what he wants to do. And what he's going to be able to do. And lots of times he would say, look, I know the money's a problem. You have to set priorities, and they're based on your values, and then the decision is easy to do. Well, that's a plan, but it still doesn't get around the fact that there may be a fiscal crisis. So I think issues like education, I think the social welfare system being a little bit on edge, I think that I think he has good ideas for that, and I think that he is quite skilled at doing those kinds of things, but it's not about just short-term skills. It's also about these long-term structural factors, like, do we have the resources to do it? Yeah, sure. And I mean, the university is a good example of that. I know he's a strong supporter of the university, but that doesn't mean anything until we look at what the money situation is and until the legislature looks at it. The fact that he would be governor and you'd have an overwhelming Democratic legislature is probably better for him than the alternative. But, any Democratic governor has had problems with his own legislature. Ben Cayetano certainly did.
No, but I want to go to that as a last point of discussion, and that is, we've had 8 years of what I would consider contention between a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, and in many ways it was dysfunctional, more than it ordinarily is. So now, are we going to get back to a better business as usual? Are we going to have a better relationship? Are we going to have at least for a while, a kind of enlightened relationship between the fifth floor and the fourth and third floors and second floors?
Well, see, I don't know if I would use the word enlightened. It has more potential for cooperation, but more potential doesn't mean it actually happens. You still have to work at it. I guess what I'm saying is that if you think of two problems that Linda Lingo had, one was contention, and the other was money. Even if you get rid of the contention one, you still have this other formidable factor here. So, everybody working together in an economy that gives you very little space to move, that limits what you can do too. But I think you'll see a somewhat different dynamic here. But the interesting thing, one other thing is even though the Republicans and Lingo had this contention, you really never saw a Democrat in the legislature, either in the House or Senate, emerge as the kind of leader, as the spokesperson against Lingo. That always astonished me, because I thought one of the ways you can build yourself as a candidate for governor is the day after someone from the opposing party is elected, you begin to become the spokesperson for the opposition. And not only did that never happen, but they don't really get a good candidate for governor during her second term.
Well, is it possible we will have that we do have a kind of environment now, a vacuum, if you will, after these past 8 years, where Neil Abercrombie, assuming he wins the election in November, could emerge as a strong governor, a strong leader? I know we need that, but is the environment ripe for that?
it's very hard to be a strong leader in this environment, even though people claim they want it. It's hard because of the money issue, as I've said many times now. It's also hard because of an inherent skepticism toward politics, cynicism toward politics that's actually stronger than ever. I think there are certain issues that you can watch this on where there is room to move, and where it's highly important, and where in some ways it's less partisan, and that may be education. K-12 is an area that you could really try to score some progress with, both moving to DOE. Now, it's also a very tough one because a lot of the issues that get defined as issues politicians can deal with in education really are not so much political issues, but more issues of culture and one-on-one classroom stuff. But still, to be able to set a tone for reform in there, and to be able to make some changes, and to be able to do some butt kicking, both with with people in favor of the status quo, that's an area where you could have some important changes. Who knows on the environment, on sustainability? That's an important one, but it never quite gets the traction that some of these other ones do.
Well, if you educate K-12 better now, you're educating voters better in the future.
That's true.
And that we can all benefit by that.
Sure. Well, we can benefit from better K-12 education for all kinds of reasons.
Many ways.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Don't have to tell me. I've been reading papers, so for my students.
You are in
now.
the education
yes,
business,
I am.
for sure.
I have a vested interest in it. Yeah.
So do we all.
Yes.
Thanks, Neil.
You're welcome. Jay.
Great to
Take
have
care.
you here.
Sure.